Welcome to Crimson Secrets. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories that polite society never talks about out loud. And before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love knowing where our family is. Now, let's get into it. She didn't say a word when she saw it. That was the part that people who knew Annette Beaumont couldn't quite believe. Afterward, that she had stood in the middle of the Hargrove Tower lobby, champagne in hand, wearing $3.2 million worth of her own company's stock as a metaphor, and she had simply looked at the woman across the room and done nothing. No scene, no sharp intake of breath, loud enough for anyone nearby to notice. She had taken one slow sip of her champagne, set the glass down on the tray of a passing waiter, and turned to say something gracious to the woman beside her about the floral arrangements. But Annette had seen it. The bracelet on the wrist of the woman in the ivory silk dress. The woman who had been standing a little too close to Annette's husband Graham, laughing a little too easily at something he'd said. That bracelet did not belong to her. It belonged to Annette's mother. Annette Beaumont had not become the CFO of a publicly traded pharmaceutical company by reacting to things before. She understood them completely. She had spent 22 years mastering the particular art of stillness. The kind that looks like composure and works like a weapon. She knew in that moment that whatever was happening in this room, she would not understand the full shape of it for another few hours. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had been building contingency plans since she was 31 years old, that she had time. What she did not know yet, what she would not know until almost midnight, was exactly how far Graham had gone. But we need to go back a little. Because the night of the Hargrove Tower charity gala was not where the story started. It started, like most betrayals do, in a quiet moment that felt perfectly ordinary at the time. 3 weeks earlier, Annette had been at her mother's house in Pasadena, helping the woman sort through a lifetime of carefully organized chaos. Her mother, Genevieve Beaumont, was 81 years old, and in the first stages of the kind of cognitive decline that announces itself gently and then accelerates without warning. Genevieve still had her wit. She still had her sharpness in the mornings, her humor at dinner, her near photographic memory for anything that had happened before 1995. It was the recent things that slipped. Appointments, whether she'd taken her medication, the name of the woman who came on Thursdays to help with the house. Annette had driven out on a Sunday to help organize the jewelry cabinet in the master bedroom. It was something her mother had been asking her to do for months. Genevieve had a system. She always had a system. But the system had started to fray at the edges, and certain pieces had been placed in the wrong drawers, and Genevieve found this distressing in a way she couldn't quite articulate, but felt deeply. The bracelet was among the pieces they'd handled that afternoon. It wasn't the most expensive thing in the cabinet. Genevieve Beaumont had owned more valuable jewelry in her life. A sapphire ring from the 1970s, a pair of diamond earrings that Annette's late father had given her on their 30th anniversary. But the bracelet was different. It was a Victorian-era gold cuff set with a series of small matched garnets, and it had been in Genevieve's family for 4 generations. It had been made for Annette's great-great-grandmother in 1887. There were photographs of it dating back to 1912. "This goes to you when I'm gone," Genevieve said, not with any drama, just the matter-of-fact certainty of a woman who had made her decisions and written them down. "Mom, I'm not being morbid. I'm being organized." "You know I'm always organized." She turned the bracelet over in her hands once and then set it gently back in its velvet tray, in the drawer that Annette had just lined with fresh paper. "Don't let Graham sell it." Annette looked up. "What?" Genevieve's eyes held hers for a moment, sharp, present, entirely lucid. "I'm not confused," she said. "I just want you to hear me." Annette had driven home that evening and told herself her mother was simply anxious. Genevieve had always been a little cool toward Graham. He was charming in the way that sometimes is read as effortful. And Genevieve Beaumont had very little patience for effort that wasn't genuine. But it wasn't more than that. It couldn't be. She had been very good at telling herself these things. Graham Beaumont was 54 years old, and he had spent most of their marriage being the person in the room that other people remembered. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes either from great breeding or great practice. In Graham's case, it was entirely the latter. He had come from nothing, built himself into something, and then married Annette when she was 33, and he was 38, right at the inflection point of her career, right when she was becoming someone it was useful to be married to. Annette had known this, in a peripheral way, for a long time. She was not naive. She had watched how Graham operated in rooms, how he navigated relationships, how he always seemed to know who was rising and who was falling before anyone else did. She had found it attractive once. She had also found it useful. Their marriage had worked in the way that certain machinery works. Efficiently, dependably, without warmth, but without complaint. She had loved him in the beginning. She was no longer sure exactly when that had stopped. The woman in the ivory dress was named Celia Forde. Annette had learned this not by asking Graham. She would never have asked Graham, not then, but by making a quiet inquiry with a colleague whose husband sat on the board of the Hargrove Foundation, which had organized the gala. Celia Forde was 29 years old. She worked as a private wealth advisor at a boutique firm in Century City. She had been seeing Graham for, as best as Annette could piece together, in the weeks that followed. 14 months. 14 months. Annette had found this number almost more clarifying than anything else. 14 months meant it had started the previous spring, when she had been in Chicago for 6 weeks, overseeing the integration of a company they'd acquired. 14 months meant it had been happening during the summer they'd spent at the house in Carmel, when Graham had seemed unusually relaxed, and she had attributed it to the ocean air. 14 months meant it predated the moment her mother had looked her in the eye and said, "Don't let Graham sell it." Her mother had known, or suspected, or sensed something in the particular way that mothers sense things when their daughters are too close to see clearly. But the bracelet, that was what Annette kept coming back to. Not the 14 months, not Celia Forde's age or profession, or the way she'd laughed at Graham's jokes. The bracelet. She had not brought it up with Graham that night, at the gala. She had spoken pleasantly to Celia Forde during the cocktail hour. They had been introduced by the Foundation's events director, who had no idea what she was brokering, and Annette had shaken the woman's hand and said, "It was lovely to meet her," and looked directly at the bracelet on her wrist for exactly 1 second before moving on. She had watched Graham's face from across the room during that introduction. He had gone very still, very briefly, in the way that a person goes still when they are rapidly calculating. She had seen him do this before, in negotiations. When something surprised him that he hadn't planned for, she had never expected to recognize that expression in her own marriage. She went home that night while Graham was still at the event. He had offered to drive her home first, and she had said no, graciously, citing a headache. And she sat in the kitchen of their house in Los Feliz for a long time, without turning on the lights. Just sat with the dark and the quiet and the very specific feeling of a woman who has finally allowed herself to know something. She has been carefully not knowing for a long time. Then she got up, made herself a cup of tea, and started thinking clearly. The first call she made was to her attorney, Beverly Kwan. Annette did not call Beverly dramatically or emotionally. She called her the following Monday morning, professionally, the way she called her about everything. She said she needed to understand the full picture of her financial exposure in the event of a dissolution of her marriage, and she needed to understand it quietly and quickly. And she needed Beverly to recommend a forensic accountant who could work discreetly. Beverly had been Annette's attorney for 11 years. She did not ask unnecessary questions. What the forensic accountant, a careful, unsmiling man named Portis, found over the following 2 weeks was more than Annette had anticipated, and she had anticipated quite a lot. Graham had been moving money, not brazenly, not stupidly. Graham was never stupid, but systematically, in amounts small enough to fall below the thresholds that would trigger automatic flags. Routed through a series of accounts that he had opened quietly over the past 3 years, using a variant of a holding company that Annette had never had reason to scrutinize. He had been siphoning from accounts that were technically joint but practically invisible to her, Accounts she had trusted him to manage as part of an informal division of household responsibilities they had maintained for over a decade. The total Portis identified, conservatively, a little over $2 million. Annette sat with this information for one full day. She did not confront Graham. She did not change her behavior at home, did not become cold or distant or distracted in ways he might notice. She attended 2 work dinners that week and sat beside him at both. She answered his texts promptly. She slept in the same bed. She also sent a very specific email to Beverly, ceasing Portis, that outlined exactly what she wanted to happen next and in what order. And then she waited for the Hargrove Foundation's annual exhibition dinner, the second event of their 2-part charitable season, scheduled for 3 weeks after the gala, at which Annette was being honored for the company's philanthropic contributions of the previous year. She had decided she was going to enjoy the evening. The thing about Annette Beaumont that most people understood intellectually but rarely felt viscerally until they were across a table from her was this: she was not interested in spectacle. She had seen what spectacle did to women in her industry. She had watched colleagues fall apart publicly, make demands that could be documented, say things in anger that had to be walked back. She had spent her career understanding that the most devastating thing a woman in a position of power could do to someone who had underestimated her was to remain completely, unshakably composed while the other person unraveled. She wore midnight blue to the exhibition dinner, not red. Red was a statement, and she didn't need to make a statement. Midnight blue was the color of a woman who knew exactly where she was standing. Graham wore his charcoal Armani. Celia Forde was there because of course she was. The Hargrove Foundation ran in a social world that was smaller than it appeared from the outside, and Celia's firm sponsored 2 tables at the annual dinner. Annette had known she would be there. She had factored this in. The bracelet was on Celia's wrist again. This time, Annette looked at it longer. Long enough for Celia to notice she was looking. Long enough for something to shift in Celia's expression. A small uncertainty, a flicker, of something she couldn't name but felt. The dinner was seated and elegant, with speeches between courses. Annette was introduced midway through the evening by the Foundation's president, a gracious woman named Harriet Sung, who spoke warmly about the company's community health initiatives. Annette took the podium and gave the remarks she had prepared, confident, specific, humanizing without being sentimental, and received the kind of sustained applause that means people are genuinely moved rather than just being polite. She returned to her table. Graham squeezed her hand. She let him. And then, an hour later, it began. It began because of Celia Forde, actually, which was not something Annette had planned for but had considered as a possibility. Celia excused herself from her table during dessert and walked to the restroom at the far end of the room. And Annette, who had positioned herself with a clear sight line to most of the room, by virtue of requesting a specific table placement from the events coordinator 3 weeks ago, watched Graham watch Celia walk away. And then she watched Graham stand, murmur something to the man beside him, and follow. She gave it 4 minutes. Then she stood, told the woman to her left that she needed some air, and walked. Not to the restroom, not toward the corridor Graham had taken, but to the events coordinator's station near the entrance, where she spoke quietly for approximately 90 seconds. When she came back to the room, she took a slightly different path than the one she'd left by. It was a path that happened to pass the side corridor near the east wing of the venue. She did not stop walking. She did not look in. She simply walked at a natural pace and heard, for exactly the 3 seconds it took her to pass the corridor entrance, Graham's voice saying something low and urgent, and Celia's voice responding with the word "tonight" and something else she didn't catch. She didn't need to catch it. She went back to her seat. She finished her dessert. She waited. 40 minutes later, the evening's program concluded, and the room began the slow dissolution of after-dinner conversation. Clusters, forming and shifting. People finding coats, waitstaff beginning the quiet orchestration of cleanup at the margins. This was the moment Annette had been thinking about for 2 weeks. She found Celia near the exit, coincidentally, which was not coincidence. "Celia," she said pleasantly, just the first name, as though they were well acquainted. Celia turned. Up close, she was younger looking than Annette had expected, with the kind of face that was still deciding what it was going to be. She looked surprised to be addressed. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said carefully. "Annette, please?" Annette smiled, the particular smile that she deployed in 1,000 negotiations, the one that made the other person feel included rather than cornered, right up until they understood they were cornered. "That bracelet is extraordinary, may I?" She reached out her hand, not grabbing, just gesturing, inviting Celia to extend her wrist. The universal gesture of one woman admiring another woman's jewelry. Celia hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and then, because she was in public, and because Annette's manner made refusal feel strange and rude, she extended her wrist. Annette looked at the bracelet. She did not touch it. "Victorian," she said. "Gold cuff, matched garnet. Settings, I'd say 1880s. There's a hallmark on the inner edge, if you look closely, a jeweler's mark from London. The woman who commissioned it was named Helen Voss. She was my great-great-grandmother." Celia's expression changed so completely and so quickly that Annette felt, despite everything, a moment of something close to sympathy for her. The younger woman went from politely social to genuinely stricken in the space of about 2 seconds. "I didn't." Celia started. "I know," Annette said, and she meant it. Her voice was entirely calm. "I know, you didn't know. I could tell when I saw it at the gala that you had no idea, which is why we're having this conversation privately." Celia's hand came up and covered the bracelet almost reflexively. Her face had gone pale. "Graham told me it was. He said it had been in his family. It was in mine." The silence between them lasted only a moment, but it held a considerable amount of weight. "I need it back," Annette said simply, "and I think you understand why. And I think you may also, now that you're looking at me, rather than at the version of this situation that Graham described to you, want to give it back." Celia looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, toward the far end of the room, where Graham was still working the post-dinner circuit, shaking hands, tilting his silver head toward people in that attentive way of his. She looked back at Annette. Without a word, she unclasped the bracelet and placed it in Annette's palm. Her hands were shaking slightly. Annette noticed this and said nothing about it. "Thank you," Annette said. And then, "I'd recommend you speak to a lawyer before Graham has the opportunity to speak to his. What he told you about your relationship, and what that relationship actually was, legally, financially, those may be 2 different things." She paused. "That's not a threat. That's just information. You can do with it whatever you'd like." Celia nodded once, very slightly, like someone who had just understood something large and was still absorbing the shape of it. Annette put the bracelet on her own wrist. It sat there exactly as it should, the way it had sat on photographs of women in her family going back 130 years. Then she turned and walked back into the room. Graham found her 20 minutes later. He had been scanning the room for a while. She'd watched him do it, peripherally, while maintaining a perfectly normal conversation with Harriet Sung about the foundation's plans. For next year, she had watched his eyes move through the crowd, then find her, then move quickly to the place where Celia had been standing, then back to her, then to her wrist. He went very still. Annette excused herself from Harriet and walked toward him, unhurriedly. She stopped at a comfortable conversational distance, not close enough for intimacy, not far enough to signal anything public. "We should get going," she said pleasantly. "I have an early call tomorrow. Annette." "It's late, Graham." He looked at her wrist again. His jaw was tight. She could see him calculating, rapidly, in the way she'd recognized at the first gala, in the way she'd spent 2 weeks preparing for. "We can talk at home," she said, in a tone that made clear they would not be talking at home, and that he was being given the opportunity to exit this room without incident, and that this opportunity had a very specific expiration. He took it. They drove home mostly in silence. Graham attempted something in the car, a partial explanation that died in his throat before it became a sentence, and Annette said, "Not tonight," in a voice that closed the subject entirely. At home, he went to his study. She went upstairs. She put the bracelet on the dresser, in the dish where her mother had always kept it, and she stood there for a moment looking at it. Then she picked up her phone and sent a brief text to Beverly. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., everything we discussed." She slept 7 hours. The divorce filing happened 11 days later. Portis's documentation was thorough enough that Graham's attorney advised him, within 48 hours of receiving Beverly's initial correspondence, that a contested proceeding would be expensive and very likely unsuccessful. The financial forensics were precise. The paper trail was clear. Graham had moved $2.1 million over a period of 38 months, and the methodology was documented in detail that left very little room for alternate interpretation. The settlement negotiations took 4 months. They were not pleasant, but they were not chaotic. Annette's position was clear and consistent throughout, and she did not deviate from it, and eventually Graham's position adjusted to meet hers. She kept the house. She kept her company's shares, which were, in any case, always hers. She recovered the full $2.1 million plus interest and legal costs. Graham kept the car he cared about, a watch collection that she had no interest in, and the version of his life that he was apparently willing to accept. Celia Forde had, by the time the proceedings concluded, retained her own counsel and was pursuing a separate matter regarding certain representations Graham had made to her during their relationship. Annette knew this not because she had followed it closely, but because Beverly had mentioned it in passing. She did not involve herself. She wished Celia, in an abstract way, a reasonable outcome. She visited her mother in Pasadena on a Tuesday in October. 3 weeks after the settlement finalized, she brought good coffee and a lemon cake from the bakery Genevieve had loved for 40 years. Her mother was having a sharp day. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Annette arrived, reading a physical newspaper, wearing a cardigan the color of dried roses. Annette set the coffee and the cake on the table, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down. Then she extended her wrist. Genevieve looked at the bracelet for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked up at her daughter. "Good," she said simply. "You knew," Annette said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a thing that needed to be said out loud between them. "I suspected." Genevieve poured coffee into the mug her daughter set in front of her. "You were too close to see it." "I know. You figured it out. Eventually." Genevieve nodded, in the way she always had, once firmly the gesture of a woman closing a topic that had been fully addressed and no longer required further airtime. Then she opened the lid of the cake box and examined it with the focused satisfaction of someone who had been looking forward to exactly this. "Cut me a big piece," she said. "You always cut them too small." Annette laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere down in the chest. She picked up the knife. Outside, the October light was doing what it does in Southern California in the fall, cutting at a lower angle, turning everything gold. The lemon cake smelled like butter and sugar, and her mother's kitchen, the bracelet, was on her wrist. She cut her mother a big piece, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. If this story moved you, if you know someone who needed to hear it, share it with them. Leave a comment below, and if you're new here, welcome to Crimson Secrets. We'll see you in the next one.